slide?
Yes.
All right.
Tribute. I want to say Tuesday. I think one of the biggest causes of the war, well, America getting involved, is just Wilson wanted to get his influence on Europe. Because, he had that Messiah complex.
Because he wanted to violate the isolation.
He wanted, just want them to be like him.
Found out yesterday his wife was like a true baller. I didn't know anything about her until recently. Evidently, Wilson was single when he was elected there in the White House, and he courted this woman. Ended up marrying him and having a huge influence on him. So we got through all of this,
Yes.
but not this.
No.
Okay. Well, let's do this then.
Presidents seem to get around a lot.
Yeah. Even some who are married in the White House.
Warren G. Harding and JFK.
John F. Kennedy comes to mind. Yeah, Harding comes to mind.
Speaking of Harding, isn't Harding's presidency a lot alike to Grant's?
He what?
Isn't Harding's presidency a lot like Grant's with the corruption?
Oh yeah, big time corruption in that administration.
Wasn't he
Teapot Dome scandal and all that. Yeah.
But he didn't want it though, did he? Like Grant didn't want it.
Oh, U.S. Grant's administration was probably the most corrupt of all time, but yeah, a lot of it was apparently not with his knowledge or blessing, so may not reflect necessarily on him. But we'll see. I don't know. In the other class, we actually started in Tony's lecture, in which case we would talk about Harding, but I don't know. I don't know if I want to do that or not. Believe it or not, I would also like to get to spring break. So, yeah, it's been a heck of a week too. I've had to sit in dead stop on I-20 West for 2 hours twice this week. And were I going into town as I was coming out here, would have had to do it again, evidently, today, police chase and what happened behind me. Anyway, with that said, let's end the war. So America, as you know, entered the war at a crucial time. Russia has pulled out of the war. Morale is abysmally low. The United States helps defeats the Germans on the Western Front, and that goes a long way in ending the war, period, in November of 1918. At that time, then, it is decided that with the Central Powers totally defeated, unconditional surrender, that there would be a peace conference in Paris, and that the leaders of the victorious Allies will all send representatives to said conference to talk about the terms of peace with the defeated Central Powers. Wilson gives a speech to Congress before he goes, in which he kind of lays out what he wants to do there, and what he wants to see in terms of the peace and the world moving forward. And he lays out what come to be known as Wilson's 14 points. I'm not going to go through all 14 of them, but in essence, he envisioned like a new democratic world order. To celebrate that those autocratic empires, the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires have been defeated. And to hopefully see in their place the new liberal democracies like America, Britain, and France. At the heart of this vision, too, is one of liberal internationalism. Liberal internationalism, in short, means international cooperation. International cooperation, open diplomacy, as opposed to secret treaties, right? And secret alliances. Perhaps even in the form of a peacekeeping body, a world peacekeeping body, like a League of Nations, to which all nations of the world could send a representative or representatives, and where you could engage in diplomacy openly next time there is a crisis, and to potentially avoid another world war the next time someone assassinates an archduke.
I'm sorry, what was liberal internationalism?
International cooperation.
Gotcha, thank you.
I guess we're doing a little bit better than I thought. We're working on Bagley now. So,
Yes, we are working on yours. I'm surprised you're here.
all right, I'm doing good today. Well, in this class, anyway. We're talking about Wilson's 14 points and the concept of liberal internationalism or international cooperation, most especially through the League of Nations. But this would also include freedom of the seas, free trade, and this kind of thing, as opposed to tariff wars and blockades.
One of the big flaws of the League of Nations was that it was very Eurocentric in its governing. A lot of countries felt very, very screwed over by what little decisions it made,
Yeah.
namely Japan.
Yeah, we'll talk about when Japan leaves the League of
Japan
Nations.
was technically part of the Allies. And by part of the Allies, I mean they stole a lot of Germany's land.
They did. They did exactly that. The other thing to note, since we've gone there, is the League of Nations will be created, but America does not join. Wilson had alienated members of the Republican Party, he being a Democrat, who were in control of Congress. And for America to join such a body, it would have to have, it's like a treaty, and treaties have to be ratified by Congress. So he basically, pissed them off for a variety of reasons, and then had a stroke and was incapacitated, and they voted it down. So the League of Nations will be created, but America will not be a member. What else does Wilson talk about in 14 points? The idea of self-determination. That peoples of the world should be able to determine for themselves what their government will be. And do we see that in the aftermath in these peace treaties and whatnot? We shall see. Some took from that the idea that perhaps Wilson is suggesting an end to imperialism. Does that mean the colonies of the world should have self-determination, be able to determine for themselves what their government will be? You can probably guess the answer to that one. So, appreciate that Wilson is one man. And appreciate that the United States of America was not the great superpower of the world that it would come to be after World War II. So Wilson can't just bust up in there and be like, what's up, this is what it's going to be. There are others. You don't have to know their names, but this is David Lloyd George. He's the Prime Minister of Great Britain. This is Georges Clemenceau. He's the President of France. They carry a lot more weight. America entered the war late. It didn't have the loss of life of those other nations. It didn't see, like France, destruction of its own homeland. They've got other things that they want to prioritize, and for them, the number one thing is punishing Germany. In their mind, Germany, more than any other nation, was responsible for this conflict, and it should be held accountable. And so, in the Treaty of Versailles, the one signed with Germany, they forced Germany to sign it onto a war guilt clause, that is, a clause in the treaty saying that the war was their fault. And the point of this is not simply to rub their nose in it, but to provide the legal basis for reparations. To force Germany to pay to Britain and France reparations, that is, in both cash and resources.
Which immediately crashed their economy as it required more money than Germany had ever printed.
Right. For the cash and resources for the cost of the war. And yes, part of the idea was this would help Britain and France recover, while at the same time, at a minimum, holding Germany back, if not crippling its economy in the near term, which is precisely what it did for a good while.
Which it somehow did not cripple their war economy, which seems just fine later.
Yeah, we'll talk about that. It's partly the U.S. steps in and helps finance. But then there's the Depression, which ruins it all over again, and then obviously we'll talk about the rise of Hitler and the Nazis in the later lecture. But
Wasn't the Treaty of Versailles a bit too spiteful?
was it what?
Wasn't the Treaty of Versailles too spiteful because all of the people that they're condemning for the World War I they're just supporting Nazism with all the reformations they're hitting them with.
This would be part of the key argument of Hitler when the Nazis do come to power, to blame Britain and France for everything that was wrong with Germany and to say that it was done out of spite. And that, we'll talk about that when we get there. But yes, this was done out of an egregious measure of spite and didn't need to be as harsh as it was. But Germany will also lose some territory, as we'll see. If you consider the Treaty of Versailles along with the other treaties that are signed ending the war, the other two central powers cease to be. The Austro-Hungarian Empire will be no more. Look at that map of Europe now. They have the creation of a nation-state of Austria, but not under the Habsburg dynasty. They are finished. You have a nation-state of Hungary here, but look at this. Yugoslavia, including the former Serbia. That is the pan-Slavic state envisioned by Gavrilo Princip when he murdered Franz Ferdinand. And look at the other area here, including the northern reaches of former Austria-Hungary and parts of Germany, Czechoslovakia,
Which,
another pan-Slavic state.
yeah, I noticed one of the descriptions I heard for how the Austrian Empire broke apart was a kid arriving late to the party and divorcing another kid's parents. Like,
Yeah.
it's very weird that America made that decision.
Yeah, that is a fair interpretation. Consider though that the map it looks very different. And then what about north of Czechoslovakia? That is land largely that the Russians had signed away to the Germans when they quit the war. And then Germany loses, and so the Polish people are given self-determination, and that becomes the nation state of Poland. So self-determination question mark in Europe, yes, to a degree. Creation of Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, and Poland would seem to be a measure of self-determination. What about the old Ottoman Empire, which is now no more? It lives on as the nation state of Turkey, here or here. What about its possessions in the Middle East? They in effect become colonies of Britain and France. They call them mandates, and they're given home rule, but Britain and France will control their resources, like most especially oil. So
Turkey
they are,
was not supposed to exist under these treaties. It basically forced itself into existence through being the most successful in rebelling against the terms Britain and France set out.
True. And not becoming in itself a mandate as these do. So these arbitrarily drawn lines, the creation of the nation state of Iraq, well, not the mandate of Iraq, I should say, along with Jordan and Palestine, which are under the administration of Britain, and then Syria here and Lebanon, which would be under the administration largely of France. So self-determination for the Middle East, not really. Into imperialism, absolutely not. You mentioned a moment ago how Japan had joined the Allies at one point, and in return for that is allowed to take control of German colonies in East Asia and the Pacific. Germany's colonies in Africa are divvied up, and so there is no end to imperialism at all. And let's see. Meanwhile, soldiers returning from the front to Britain, France, America, Germany, everywhere else, start getting very ill with the H1N1 virus, and this particular outbreak being avian in origin, so a bird flu that jumps to humans. This happened, I don't know, was it 2008 or so? When it came from pigs, jumped to humans, they called it the swine flu. There was an outbreak of H1N1 around that time that was pretty bad, although not remotely as bad as COVID, of course. But in any case, this one was very bad. It was especially deadly for people between the ages of 20 or so and 40, which would be a lot of soldiers who had been serving on the front, who fall very sick when they come back to places like America and realize what this is. But while the war is still going on, nations that are still at war have censors. And those censors didn't want it to get out of the press that as bad as the war already was, that we also have this massive outbreak of a terrible pandemic that's killing now perhaps millions of people, so they censored it. The Spanish, as you pointed out last time, are a neutral country. Their journalists did cover it, and so people start calling it the Spanish flu, even though it was not at all Spanish.
It originated in Kansas.
It was first discovered at Fort Riley in Kansas, right? In terms of global and U.S. infections and deaths, I mean, we're talking about infections in the hundreds of millions. I think around 600,000+ dead in the United States. Worldwide, 50 million deaths from this. As grisly and as awful as the Great War was, to have this pandemic on the tail end of it and extending the misery into 1920 is something extraordinary. So, I told you we would have to work our way through what happens in Russia in 1917 and why Russia pulls out of the war from the Allied side, because this has profound consequences for the United States and for the world in the 20th century. And we can't continue talking about America in the 20th century if we don't talk about what happened in Russia in 1917. So there are two revolutions in Russia. So let's talk about Russia entering that year. It remained an empire. It was the one on the Allied side in Europe that was an empire with an emperor known as a Tsar. There he is, Nicholas II and his lovely family, the Romanov dynasty, whose reign had become especially unpopular even before the Great War. They had tried to overthrow the Tsar in 1905, and that had failed, and he brutally crushed that uprising.
It was sort of a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation where basically they'd gotten themselves into an endless loop of bad publicity because their son was a hemophiliac who was constantly like on the verge of death. There was only one man in the world who could heal him from their perspective, and that man was Rasputin, who was a good friend of the family at that point.
Right.
But they couldn't tell anybody why he was their friend, so it seemed like he was manipulating them. And then all of those rumors of them being manipulated by foreign powers led them to becoming insular with no way to defend themselves against them, which spiraled further and further and further into literally no one trusting them.
Very all true, yeah.
There was even an assassination attempt on him when he was in Japan.
Yeah.
And I believe he had the scar, like on his, like he had cut with a sword and it was down his face or head or something.
They also were in a very bad place after losing the entire Black Sea fleet.
Yeah.
Sorry, not Black Sea, Baltic fleet against Japan earlier.
Yeah, the Russo-Japanese War. Sometimes you forget Russia extends all the way over in the east to China and Japan. That at times are going very badly for them. That makes them unpopular.
They actually destroyed a couple of their ships with friendly fire on the way over.
Yeah. And peasants are unhappy, workers are unhappy, aristocrats who ought to have influence are unhappy because, like you said, they've got this crackpot lunatic Rasputin who supposedly heals their hemophiliac son Alexei
And if they did clear all of that up, that would mean the Tsar's son was on the verge of death and he didn't have proper air. So,
yeah,
even more unstable.
So then you enter the war, and all that disaffection only grows because you're losing millions of young men at the front. It's a war that increasingly people do not understand, and
there is a very important worst part to this. Nicholas leaves the country to personally lead the war and stake his entire right to rule on it, and leaves his German wife in charge of the country.
Yeah, the Tsarina Alexandra. He did indeed do that because the last thing he wanted to do is lose the army, but there were increasingly these little Soviets or groups in the army that are organizing against him. And also in the cities you had women who were working all day long in factories for the war effort and then had to wait in bread lines for 8 hours at night in order to take bread home to feed their children. Those women end up in March of 1917 going on strike. That strike becomes a general strike in the city of Petrograd, or what they come to call St. Petersburg. And that spills over into Moscow, and there was a revolution in March, the first revolution of this year, that brings to power what they call a provisional government.
Which was
This provisional government was led by a guy named Kerensky, which was going to steer Russia away from being an empire, and I mean they overthrew the Tsar after all, and was going to turn Russia into a liberal democracy in the mold of Britain or France.
But not necessarily a liberal democracy, as the provisional government also had the full support and members from the mainline Communist Party in Russia.
Yeah. Well, their one major mistake, apart from that, was that the provisional government did not pull Russia out of the war. And what that allows for is a guy named Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, or Lenin, V.I. Lenin, to re-enter the country from exile with the actual assistance of the Germans and to tell people that he will give them, if they will support him, peace, land, and bread. That's Lenin's pitch. Peace, land, and bread. Meaning we'll quit the war, we'll redistribute land to peasants, and we will prosper again. You won't have to wait in bread lines all day long and starve half to death.
I'm sorry because of how much I bring stuff up, but this is also an important thing to understand. If you were a peasant, you did not own land. The land owned you. You were property of the dirt beneath your feet in Russia.
Russia had practiced a policy known as serfdom for many centuries, and so it had only been abolished very recently, where most Russian peasants had essentially lived as more or less slaves, not quite a system of chattel slavery like in America, but similar to that you were tied to that land.
And abolishment is kind of, it was abolished, but that's a thing of, it kept getting abolished and unabolished every other year throughout history. So people didn't put a lot of stock in that.
Yeah. So Lenin promising the land redistribution goes a long way, and so he is the leader of a group called the Bolsheviks. They are revolutionary socialists, and they grow their power in these little councils called Soviets among soldiers at the front, among peasants in the fields, and among workers in the factories. And they overthrow the provisional government in October, and they come to power as the Communist Party. And under their leadership, eventually, it takes a long civil war for them to consolidate their power, but under their leadership, Russia will become known as the Soviet Union. So let's pause for a minute and understand what it is these people believe in when we say they are revolutionary socialists, and this will be the connection to this in an American history course. So, first of all, what is socialism in general? I'll give you a sort of economics-based definition that directs our attention to what we call the means of production. The means of production, economically speaking. What do you produce in an economy? Two kinds of things. One, manufactured goods. Where are those produced? In factories. So factories, means of production one. What about agricultural products produced on the land, i.e. on farms? So the means of production would be factories and farms. So in a capitalist economy like we have, factories are owned by corporations, individually. They're individually and privately owned. Land is individually and privately owned. In a socialist economy or society, the means of production are socially owned, meaning collectively there is no individual ownership of that property, meaning the land, the farmland, belongs to the peasants who work it. Meaning the factories belong to the workers who work in them. Does that make sense? There is no individual ownership of those means of production. That's true socialism. There were at the time in Russia and in the United States democratic socialists who maybe didn't envision abolishing private property ownership, but who envisioned some kind of redistribution of
Private
wealth.
property is also a term that you don't understand initially when you hear about this. Private property does not mean the ability to own things. Private property is things that you use to make money. Private property is farmland. It is apartment buildings. It is factories. It is all of this. Private property is not your house. It is not the things that you use in your daily life. That is personal property, and it's very different.
Right,
Under
exactly.
this.
Yeah,
So most democratic socialists would believe in abolishing private property.
in that sense, right. So we talk about Eugene Debs is a democratic socialist in America who runs for president while in prison in Atlanta. The leader of the Wobblies, former leader of the Pullman strike. And again, there was a group called the Mensheviks in Russia at the time who were democratic socialists. They believe in elections, right? They believe in some form of a democratic system. People like Lenin rejected that and said the only true way to institute socialism is through a violent revolution. Because what you're talking about, in essence, is taking people's stuff. And people aren't going to let that go lightly, and people are not going to let go of a social system and an economic system we've had for centuries lightly. It will take a violent revolution to get to what we want. And ultimately what they wanted is a classless society. to move away from a world where there's an upper class of wealthy people, a middle class, and then an oppressed working class. And to get to what they would call a communist utopia, where people lived in communes and those little Soviet-like councils would run the factories and the farms and so on.
Socialism is in communist theory, not necessarily in anyone else who ever talks about it, the middle step between capitalism and communism.
Right, exactly. And so that communist utopia is what you envision down the road. So they call themselves the Communist Party. Russia becomes the Soviet Union. And politically, what happens is it becomes a dictatorship. Other political parties are outlawed. The regime would not respect freedom of speech, or there would be no free press. Lenin would argue in his lifetime that it was the, quote, dictatorship of the proletariat, meaning I'm only doing this temporarily on behalf of you, the working people and the peasants. It was not to be. The man that comes after him is an even more ruthless and brutal dictator than Joseph Stalin, we'll talk about. So it becomes, in essence, a police state where it's a crime to oppose the government. It becomes what we'll later talk about as a totalitarian regime, but one with a Marxist worldview. Karl, with a K, Marx, was a German philosopher who wrote in the late 1800s works that Lenin and others would read. It's somewhat similar to what we saw when we talked about Jefferson reading Locke. And Locke is dead and gone, but he left these works, and Jefferson and company see themselves putting this into being, into reality. Marx had written about this is what socialism is. This is what communism can be. And so, what is then Marx's worldview? Two things. One, it's an interpretation of history up to that point. So, Marx looks back on 100 years of world and European history and says, what has happened is you saw the old order of kings and nobles overthrown by liberal, democratic, capitalist revolutions in places like America, Britain, and France. So the old way of monarchies and nobles was overthrown in like American, French Revolution, English Glorious Revolution, and so on. But what that did in bringing about capitalism and industrialization is oppressed the working class. The second part of Marx's worldview is a prediction of the future. Workers of the world unite. Oppressed workers of the capitalist world unite and throw off your chains, and by engaging in revolution, by bringing about socialism, and by ultimately bringing out the communist utopia. Now look at the Soviet flag here. This is a hammer representing those workers in the factories. Lenin's addition to Marxism is the realization that Russia still had millions of peasant farmers and didn't really need to fully industrialize. You see this? It's a sickle like you would use to cut down grain. His idea is that the workers and the peasant farmers could unite together under the banner of the Communist Party, the star there, and they together could engage in revolution that would bring about socialism. So that is what they envision is happening under their leadership. Now, what does all or any of this have to do with American history?
That's a good question. I'm trying to figure that out.
So, Russia is not the only place where people come home from the war with revolutionary ideas. People can go home to Britain, to France, to America with these same ideas, and this gives you the lesson of, look at this, it happened in Russia, it could happen here too. So people begin to deeply fear the threat of some sort of socialist communist revolution everywhere else in the industrialized world. It could happen in Italy, it could happen in France or Britain, or indeed in America. So there's this grave threat of the very idea of socialism, somebody taking your stuff, somebody abolishing property however defined, and then throw on top of that the kind of government that the Soviets, the communists, put in power there in Russia, a one-party police state and a brutal dictatorship. So it's a threat not only to capitalism, it's a threat to liberal democracy. And it terrifies people, and it becomes what we call the Red Scare. Red being the color associated with communism. there's a deep irony in this, in the way the United States government and people in general in America react, because they start doing a whole bunch of stuff that makes them look just like the communist government in the Soviet Union. For example, mass deportation of immigrants, because it's immigrants who are bringing in these terrible revolutionary ideas.
And I never understood that because there are immigrants.
I know. Well, we've not only, that's the deep irony of America, one of them. No, we've always been a nation of immigrants, but we've also been always a nation that lashes out at immigrants. The only difference being at which point in time, who are the immigrants being lashed out against? And at this time, it's anyone from Europe, especially like Southern or Eastern Europe, they're suspected of being some crazy radical Bolshevik.
Is this the time where they was calling everybody a communist? Like, if you like the color red, you're a communist. If you do this, you're like.
This is the first time. It happens again in the late 40s and 50s. There's a second Red Scare.
Going crazy.
And they start trying to claim Martin Luther King's a communist and all this.
Everybody.
Yeah. We'll talk about that second Red Scare as well. So, mass deportation of immigrants, mass arrest of people without warrant, authorized by the U.S. Attorney General. Like they would go into a socialist or communist party, and those did exist in America. But they would go into a meeting and just arrest everybody without warrants, just because you're at a political party meeting, which is an obvious violation of your right to free speech, your right to freedom of assembly, and so on.
So I'm guessing they got let go as soon as they got put in handcuffs.
Maybe not that soon. And then you can see that individuals go into a Socialist Party office and destroy everything, especially the printing press, so you can't print your newspaper. Libraries start banning books. Schools fire teachers or professors if their thinking is too far left. The labor movement get all branded as a bunch of crazy radical communists and whatnot. So it's a bad time for people like Debs, a democratic socialist, self-proclaimed, not someone who would associate with Lenin at all, but somebody who gets branded as a radical in that way.
It's kind of funny that every single time they're more worried about the money part than they are the dictatorship part.
Right, yeah. And if they didn't realize how deep that was, they were about to find out with Stalin. So, I started the other lecture in the other class, but I didn't finish it, and I don't really feel like starting it now. So
Great.
Don't worry about it.
Spring
I
break.
think I won't. I think that'll be that. Are there any questions? Anything at all?
I have something I wanted to share about the Soviet Union. for a
Another
minute.
thing.
Yeah.
They actually did have elections, but
Really?
one candidate.
Yeah.
But see, despite that, they did actually work because your options were vote or not vote.
Yeah.
And if you did not get the vote of 50% of the population, you were out of the party, and they put someone else there until you found what people liked.
Yeah. So, quote unquote election.